My name is Caroline Marsh. I'm 33. When my brother's wife handed me a bin bag of my mother's clothes 2 days after the funeral and told me the cottage had already been transferred, I didn't say a word. What she didn't know was that tucked inside my mother's old recipe tin, which she'd given me 3 Christmases before she got sick, was a handwritten codicil signed in front of a witness, dated 4 months before the will that Deborah claimed was final. The moment I set that document on the solicitor's desk and watched Deborah's solicitor go very, very still, that's where I want to start. Before I take you there, if you've ever had someone try to take something that was never theirs to take, hit subscribe. Let's go back to the beginning. My mother's name was Patricia Marsh, and she was the kind of woman who pressed wildflowers between the pages of library books she never returned. She lived in Thornbury Cottage in the village of Alderton in Gloucestershire, a small stone house at the end of a lane that flooded every February without fail. The walls were thick and slightly damp no matter the season. The kitchen smelled permanently of rosemary because she kept a pot of it growing on the windowsill above the sink and would pinch the leaves whenever she passed. She had lived in that cottage for 26 years. My father had died when I was 11, and she had stayed. She said the house knew her now, and she wasn't about to confuse it by leaving. I grew up in that kitchen. I learned to make short crust pastry on that kitchen table, standing on a wooden step stool because I couldn't reach the surface properly. My mother would stand beside me and say, "Cold hands are a gift, Caroline, don't rush the butter," and I believed everything she told me. When I was 18, I left for university in Bristol. When I was 22, I came back for a summer and stayed a year. When I was 26, I moved to Bath for a job in architectural illustration. I was 40 minutes from Alderton. I came every Sunday. My brother, Richard, 4 years older than me, had moved to Harrogate when he was 24 and mostly called at Christmas. He was not unkind. He was simply the kind of man who experienced distance as something that happened to him rather than something he chose. He met Deborah Hale at a work conference in Leeds. She was a procurement manager, which I mention only because it explains something about how she approached every situation in her life, including other people's families. She was always assessing what could be acquired and at what cost. They married when Richard was 32. I was 28. I wore a blue dress I still own. My mother wore cream and looked beautiful and danced with Richard's university friend at the reception until midnight. That was the last truly easy day. The changes were not dramatic. That is what I want you to understand. There was no villain who announced herself. There was a woman who made small adjustments, and each one seemed reasonable on its own. The first Christmas after the wedding, Deborah suggested they host in Harrogate rather than Mum coming to the cottage. "It's such a long drive for her, Richard." My mother went. She came home quieter than usual. The following Easter, Deborah mentioned that my mother's stairs were a concern. She showed Richard an article on his phone about falls in older homeowners. My mother was 63 and walked 5 miles a week along the Cotswold Way. She did not have a falls risk. She had a daughter-in-law who had begun to frame her as one. Then the accounts. My mother had always managed her own finances. She was not wealthy, but she was careful, a small pension, a modest savings account, and the cottage, which was mortgage-free and valued at the time at around £380,000. In the spring of the year I turned 30, Deborah offered to help with the admin. Richard thought it was kind. My mother, who was beginning to struggle a little with her sight and found the online banking confusing, accepted. I noticed nothing at first. My mother seemed fine, subdued sometimes. She stopped mentioning the garden center in Chipping Sodbury where she used to browse on Saturday mornings. When I asked, she said she was cutting back. I assumed she meant choosing to. I did not ask the right question. The right question would have been, cutting back because you want to, or because someone has adjusted what you can access. I didn't know to ask that yet. The recipe tin was a biscuit tin from the 1980s, blue, with a faded print of English country cottages on the lid. My mother had kept it on the top shelf of the larder for my entire life. It held things she called bits and pieces that matter. Old birthday cards, a photograph of her parents at the seaside in 1971, a pressed violet from my father's garden, a paper folded into quarters that I assumed was a recipe for her Christmas cake. She gave it to me on the 23rd of December, 3 years before she died. We were in the kitchen. She had made tea. The light outside was already going at 3:30, the way it does in Gloucestershire in December, suddenly and completely. She lifted the tin from the shelf, set it in front of me on the table, and said, "I want you to keep this at yours, love, don't lose it." I asked her why. She said, "Because things have a way of going missing when I'm not paying attention." I didn't understand what she meant. I thought she was getting a little forgetful. I took the tin home to Bath. I put it on the shelf in my spare room. I did not open it for 2 years. I want to tell you about the moment I did, but first I need to tell you about Margaret Hobbs. Margaret was my mother's neighbor. She had lived in the stone house next door, separated from the cottage by a low wall and a shared apple tree, for 30 years. She was 71, a retired primary school teacher, and she had the particular quality of quiet women who have watched a great deal and said very little. She noticed everything. Margaret would later become the most important person in this story. But at this point, she was simply someone who waved at me over the garden wall on Sundays and occasionally brought my mother a piece of cake when she knew I wouldn't be visiting. She had started, she told me much later, to keep notes. My mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in February, 3 years after the tin came to live on my spare room shelf. By May, she was at home but needed help. By August, she was very tired. I drove to Alderton every Tuesday and Thursday and every Sunday. I stayed many weekends. Richard came once in the summer and once in October, both times with Deborah. Both times, Deborah asked practical questions about the property, about the lasting power of attorney, which she and Richard had helped arrange the previous year when my mother's health was first uncertain, about the contents of the will. My mother had told me the cottage would come to me. She had told me this plainly in the cottage kitchen in October of the previous year. Richard has his house in Harrogate, love, he's sorted. The cottage should stay in the family, and you're the one who's here. I believed her. I had no reason not to. In November, 2 weeks before she died, my mother reached for my hand during one of my visits and said, "Did you keep the tin safe?" I said yes. She said, "There's a letter in there, folded small at the bottom under the photograph of your Nan. Don't open it until you need to." She died on the 4th of December, at home, in the bedroom where she had slept for 26 years. I was there. I held her hand. The hospice nurse was kind and very efficient. Outside, it was raining the way it rains in Gloucestershire in winter, steadily and without pause, as if it has always been raining and always will be. That evening, I drove home to Bath with the cottage key in my coat pocket, and a hollowness in my chest that I couldn't locate precisely, only feel. It was 3 days before the funeral. I did not open the tin that night. I opened it a week after the funeral, when Deborah gave me the bin bag. I was standing in the spare room in Bath. I lifted the lid. I moved the birthday cards, the photograph of my grandmother at the seaside. I found the pressed violet, and beneath it, folded into quarters and then in half again, on a piece of cream writing paper in my mother's handwriting, the codicil. It was dated the 17th of August of the previous year. It was 2 paragraphs. It said that she wished to make an addition to her existing will, and that, in the event of any uncertainty or contradiction, this document was to be treated as expressing her most recent and settled intention. It said that Thornbury Cottage and all its contents were to pass to her daughter, Caroline Marsh, absolutely and without condition. At the bottom, in a different hand, witnessed by Margaret Patricia Hobbs, 17 August. And a phone number. I sat on the floor of my spare room and read it 4 times. Then I called Margaret Hobbs. Margaret answered on the second ring. She said, "I've been wondering when you'd call." She told me she had witnessed my mother write that document at the kitchen table. She told me my mother had been clear-eyed and deliberate and had said, "I need this to be on paper, Margaret, because I don't trust that everything I've put in place will hold." She told me my mother had been frightened, not of dying, but of what might happen to the cottage afterwards. I called Richard that evening. He was polite, he was careful. He said, "Caroline, I understand you're upset. Grief does strange things." He said the solicitors had confirmed the will was valid and the process was underway. He said Deborah had been handling the paperwork and everything was in order. He said the cottage had already been transferred into their names as beneficiaries under the existing will. I asked him if he knew about the codicil. A pause. He said, "I don't know what document you're referring to." I said, "A handwritten codicil signed by Mum and witnessed by Margaret Hobbs, dated 17 August. It postdates the will, Richard. It changes the cottage." Another pause. He said, "I'd need to speak to the solicitor." He rang off. I did not hear from him for 11 days. During those 11 days, Deborah left a message on my phone, not my voicemail, a WhatsApp message, which felt deliberate, saying that she understood I was struggling with the situation, and that she hoped we could approach this as a family without unnecessary legal intervention. She said my mother had been confused about a lot of things in her final months. She used the word confused twice. I read that message and I felt something settle in me. Not anger, something quieter than anger, a decision. I needed a solicitor. Her name was Helen Carr. She was a probate and estate litigation solicitor based in Bristol. A friend from university had used her practice for a property dispute 2 years earlier and described her as the kind of person who reads every sentence of every document and doesn't let anything go. I drove to Bristol on a Thursday morning in January with the recipe tin in a canvas bag on the passenger seat. Helen was in her mid-40s. She wore reading glasses on a cord around her neck and spoke with a precision that felt like a kindness, like she was placing each word deliberately so you'd know exactly what she meant. She read the codicil carefully. She read it twice. Then she set it flat on the desk and said, "This is valid. A handwritten codicil witnessed by a competent adult, post-dating the existing will with a clear instruction. The question is whether it was known to the estate solicitors when probate was granted." She pulled out a pad and began to write. She told me that if the codicil had been deliberately concealed during the probate process, that was not a civil matter. That was potential fraud. She told me that the transfer of the property had been registered, but that registration could be challenged if there were grounds. She told me what I needed to gather. Proof that the existing will used by Richard and Deborah's solicitors had been executed before the codicil, evidence that Margaret's witness signature was genuine, and any documentation that showed my mother's mental capacity and intention on or around the 17th of August. She said, "This will not be fast, but you have a strong document and a living witness. Those are the two things that matter most." I asked her what the chances were. She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Your mother wrote this herself in her own hand. She dated it. She had it witnessed by a neighbor she'd known for 30 years. The only question is whether the other side tries to challenge her capacity, and from what you're describing, they would have difficulty making that argument hold." I said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "Everything your mother ever said to you about her intentions, and anything you noticed that didn't feel right." I went home and I wrote 23 pages. I want to stop here and tell you about the last ordinary Sunday I spent with my mother, because it matters to me that you know who she was before the documents and the solicitors, and the formal language takes over. It was early October, the year before she died. She was still well enough to bake, though she tired easily. We made a Victoria sponge. She stood at the counter and creamed the butter and sugar while I measured flour, and she talked about the apple tree in the garden how it had produced more apples than she'd ever seen, and she didn't know what to do with them all. I said, "Give them to Margaret." She said, "I already have. Margaret says she's made 3 crumbles and a chutney and there are still apples." We laughed. The kitchen was warm. The radio was on a mid-morning program, something gentle. She said at some point, looking out at the garden, "I hope whoever lives here next loves this tree. It's a good tree." I said, "You'll be here to tell them yourself." She looked at me and smiled. Not the kind of smile that means she believed me, the kind that means she loved me enough not to argue. Later she said, "Promise me you'll trust yourself, Caroline. When something doesn't feel right, trust that." I said I would. She went back to folding the sponge mixture. I have thought about that afternoon many times in the 2 years since. I think she knew, by October, that something was being arranged around her that she didn't fully control. I think the codicil was her way of trusting herself. I think about the recipe tin every time I walk past the spare room. Helen obtained the probate file through the appropriate channels. It took 6 weeks. What she found was this: the will presented to the probate registrar was dated 3 years before my mother's death. It named Richard Marsh as primary beneficiary of the cottage and its contents, with a small cash bequest to me. The estate solicitors, a firm in Cirencester that Richard and Deborah had engaged, had certified that it represented Patricia Marsh's final testamentary wishes. The codicil did not appear anywhere in the file. Helen requested the correspondence file from the Cirencester solicitors under formal legal protocols. She found an email from Deborah dated 2 weeks after my mother's death, instructing the solicitors to proceed with probate on the basis of the existing will, and noting that she had reviewed the relevant documents held at the property. Reviewed the relevant documents held at the property. Helen read that line to me over the phone, slowly, and then said, "She was in the cottage after your mother died and before probate was complete. If she found the codicil and removed it or failed to disclose it, that is deliberate concealment of a testamentary document." She paused. "The fact that your mother gave you the tin 3 years ago and told you not to lose it, I think she foresaw this possibility." I sat with that for a long moment. My mother pressing a document into a biscuit tin, giving it to the daughter she knew would be home on Sundays, telling her, "Don't lose it." She had trusted me before I knew there was anything to protect. What followed was not a single dramatic confrontation. It was months of letters and counterletters. Richard engaged a solicitor in Harrogate. Their position, set out formally in March, was twofold. First, that the codicil might not meet the formal requirements for validity. Second, that my mother's mental and emotional state in August of the preceding year had been variable, and her capacity to make binding decisions was not established. The word "confused" appeared again. It had clearly become their strategy. Helen's response was methodical. She obtained a signed statement from Margaret Hobbs, who had been a teacher for 37 years, and who described my mother at the kitchen table on the 17th of August as entirely herself, deliberate, clear, and quite determined. She obtained records from my mother's GP showing that, at her last appointment in October of that year, she had been assessed as having full cognitive capacity. She obtained a statement from the hospice nurse who had attended my mother in her final weeks, who noted that she had been lucid and communicative until very close to the end. She also obtained something I hadn't known to mention: the bank records. Helen had filed a formal request for documentation relating to the financial management of my mother's accounts during the period when Deborah had been helping with the admin. What came back was a 3-year record showing a pattern of regular withdrawals from my mother's savings, modest amounts, individually, but totaling over the period nearly £28,000, into an account not registered in my mother's name. Helen called me when she had reviewed the file. Her voice was the same as it always was, even precise, careful. She said, "Caroline, I want you to sit down." I was already sitting. She said, There is material here that goes beyond the codicil dispute. I think you need to know that before we decide how to proceed, because it changes the nature of what we're dealing with. She walked me through the figures. £28,000. Over 3 years. Small enough amounts that they wouldn't alarm an elderly woman whose sight was worsening and who had accepted help with the admin in good faith. I thought about my mother saying she was cutting back. I thought about the garden center in Chipping Sodbury she'd stopped visiting. I thought about how she'd seemed, those last 2 years, slightly reduced, as if some dimension of her had been quietly drawn in, and I'd attributed it to age and illness and hadn't asked the harder question. I said to Helen, "What do we do?" She said, "We file." Litigation in probate matters often goes to mediation before it reaches a court. It's faster, cheaper for everyone, and judges encourage it. Our mediation was scheduled for a Thursday in June, 14 months after my mother had died, in a solicitor's meeting room in Cheltenham. I had never been in a room with Deborah in this context. I had seen her at the funeral, briefly, and at the cottage once when I'd come to collect some of my mother's things that hadn't yet been boxed. She had been civil on both occasions in the way that people who have decided they've won are civil, graciously, from a distance. She walked into the mediation room and didn't look at me for the first 6 minutes. Richard looked at me once, quickly, and then looked at the table. The mediator was a calm woman named Patricia, which I noticed, and then tried not to assign meaning to. She explained the process. She noted that both parties had exchanged evidence. She noted that this was an opportunity to resolve the matter without further cost or delay. The other side's solicitor opened by repeating their position. The codicil was of uncertain validity, my mother's capacity was disputed, and the original will should stand. Helen placed the GP records on the table, the hospice nurse's statement, Margaret's testimony, the handwritten codicil in a clear plastic wallet. Then she placed the bank records. The room went very quiet. The other solicitor asked for a short break. They were gone for 22 minutes. When they came back, Deborah was looking at the table. Richard was looking at his hands. Their solicitor said they wished to discuss a revised position. The settlement was reached by the end of that day. The cottage, Thornbury Cottage, at the end of the lane in Alderton that floods every February, was returned to my name. The transfer was reversed, the registration corrected, and the legal costs were assigned to the other side. The £28,000 in financial discrepancy was referred to a separate process, which I was advised to pursue independently. I did. That process concluded 8 months later. I won't go into the detail here, because it is still, in some ways, painful to describe, not the outcome, but the confirmation it provided of something I'd been hoping wasn't true. Richard paid back the money. He did not contest the figure. I don't know what conversation he had with Deborah. I don't know if he knew about the withdrawals or if he discovered them alongside me. I have not asked him. I do not think I will. He sent me a letter in October, handwritten, 2 paragraphs. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood what Deborah had been doing. He said he knew that might not make a difference to how I felt, and he wasn't asking me to forgive him quickly, but he wanted me to know. I have read that letter several times. I have not yet replied. I think I will, eventually. I think he is telling the truth, or most of it. I think he is a man who allowed someone else to make decisions on his behalf and stopped paying attention to what those decisions were. I know that is not the same as innocence. But it is also not the same as cruelty. Deborah and Richard separated in January of the following year. I didn't cause this. I don't claim credit and I don't feel satisfaction about it, or not the simple kind. I think what happened was that certain facts, once on the table, could not be put back. I think Richard could not unknow what the bank records showed. I think some version of who Deborah was became visible to him in that mediation room in Cheltenham, and he could not reconcile it with the version he had been married to. I heard this through a mutual family friend. I did not contact Richard to confirm it. Deborah sold the house in Harrogate and moved, I believe, to somewhere near Manchester. I have not heard from her since the day of the mediation. I expect I won't. I feel no triumph about this. I feel something more like gravity, a recognition of weight. Decisions have consequences that extend beyond their original borders. My mother knew this. I think it is why she put a folded letter in a biscuit tin and pressed it into my hands on a December afternoon and said, "Don't lose it." I moved into Thornbury Cottage in February of the year after the settlement. The lane flooded, as it always does. I put my Wellington boots by the door. The rosemary plant on the windowsill above the kitchen sink had died while the house was in dispute. Whoever had been managing the property hadn't noticed it, or hadn't cared. I bought a new one from a garden center in Chipping Sodbury. I set it on the windowsill. It took 2 weeks to look settled. I have repainted the hallway. I have fixed the catch on the back gate that my mother always meant to fix and never did. I walked the same 5 miles along the Cotswold Way that she walked. Margaret Hobbs is still in the house next door. We have tea on Tuesday afternoons. She gave me a jar of apple chutney at Christmas, made from the tree in my garden, she said, though she must have collected the apples while the house was empty, which makes me love her for it. She is the reason I have my home. The recipe tin is on the top shelf of the larder. I haven't moved it. Sometimes I come into the kitchen in the morning when the light is low, and the rosemary is on the windowsill, and I can almost hear my mother saying, "Cold hands are a gift, don't rush the butter." I'm still learning how to be in this house without her. I think that's going to take longer than any legal process. I think that's the thing nobody tells you. That winning doesn't restore what was lost. It only gives you back the place where you can begin the grief properly. I am beginning it. If you've stayed this far, thank you. I want to say one practical thing before I go, because I think it might matter to someone watching this who is in an earlier version of what I was in. If an elderly parent tells you to keep something safe, keep it. Don't ask too many questions. Don't assume they're being dramatic or sentimental. My mother was a sensible woman who understood her situation clearly and made a quiet, deliberate plan to protect her daughter. She just needed her daughter to hold one end of it. If you're in a family situation where something feels wrong and you don't know how to name it, the feeling is information. Trust it. Find a solicitor who will read the documents properly. There are people whose whole practice is built on exactly these situations, and they know what to look for faster than you will. And if you've experienced something like this, a family betrayal, an inheritance dispute, something taken that shouldn't have been, I'd like to hear about it. Leave it in the comments. I read them. I'm Caroline. This is my mother's house. Thank you for being here.